Hello, my name is Ahmed Musa, Programs Manager at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you for joining us today for a two-day virtual program on countering Islamophobia through education. The Columbia Global Centers in Amman, Tunis, and Istanbul are delighted to partner with Teachers College and the Middle East Institute at Columbia University, and to have the opportunity to hear from and engage with graduate students at Teachers College about their research on the role of education in countering Islamophobia and how it serves as a potent mechanism for de-radicalization. The students with us today are part of the class on Islam education and radicalization, led by Professor Amra Sabic-El-Rayess, who will serve as a moderator. In this course, they have been investigating the importance of education as a tool that can respond to the fast-growing radicalization movements around the world, and as an instrument that has the potential to produce immediate and long-term effects. In today's presentations, they will discuss how education can serve as a facilitator for social cohesion, capable of addressing the unique challenges that marginalization, exclusion, discrimination, racism, and radicalization pose for at-risk groups. They will contextualize their research into the broader and globally emerging trend towards religiously and/or racially seeded radicalization movements in the world today. As you all know, across the globe, in countries like the United States, France, Nigeria, India, China, Israel, Myanmar, just to name a few, there is a prevalent anti-Islam rhetoric that is reinforcing prejudices and escalating tensions in communities. This trend is manifesting in acts of violence and hate crimes that include murder and death threats, property damage and vandalism, physical and psychological assault, sexist and racist harassment, and more. In the past few years, Islamophobia has been enabled by the increasingly normalized harmful discourse popularized by politicians. It has also been facilitated by the internationalization of extreme right movements, often enabled by social media, which has spread conspiracy theories and hate across borders. So, today this is a very exciting initiative for us because this is the first time that we organize a webinar where we hear from graduate students at Columbia. So we could, it's an opportunity for them to advance what they've learned and to share with us, the most recent research on what's going on around the world. So I'll take you through in terms of what the structure of our event is going to be today. So our students are going to give two presentations. They're entitled Countering Islamophobia in the United States, a look at Access Islam. And the second presentation is Deconstructing International Educational Response to Islamophobia. This will be followed by reflections and questions from our esteemed discussants, who I would like to introduce. Our first discussant is Firat Kurt, a political anthropologist working on the intersection of political mobilization, economic infrastructures, and religious pragmatics. He is a postdoctoral research scholar at the Sabic Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia University. He has a PhD in anthropology from Columbia, an MA in sociology, and a BA in political science from Bogazici University. Our second discussant is Jihad Haj Salem. He's a countering violent extremism advisor for FHI 360 in Tunisia and a co-host of a daily political radio show on Diwan FM. Prior to this, Jihad was a researcher at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Tunis. His research focused on the daily marginalization, radicalization, and politicization processes amongst young people from working class neighborhoods in revolutionary Tunisia. I would like to thank both Firat and Jihad for joining us today, and thanks to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. We have also allocated 15 minutes for Q&A, so please pose your questions at the Q&A function rather than the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I would like now to introduce our moderator. Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess is an associate professor of practice and project director at the Center for Benefit Co-Studies in Education at Teachers College, Columbia, and an affiliated faculty at the Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies. Amra is currently working on understanding how and why societies fall apart and what role education can play in rebuilding shattered countries. Amra has published on education-related issues, and her current research examines how ultra-conservative groups leverage education, both informally and formally, to instigate changes in social norms, values, and behaviors. Amra has earned her BA in economics from Brown University. Later, she obtained 2 master's degrees and a doctorate from Columbia University. I would like now to turn over to Dr. Amra, who will briefly speak about the focus of the course before turning it over to her students.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that wonderful introduction. Really, the stars of the show today will be my students. So I am grateful to all of you for being with us today. I am also thankful to Columbia Global Centers in Amman, Istanbul, and Tunis for partnering with me on this effort to magnify the important voices of my incredible students and activists who come from all over the world, but who speak in unison against Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, as well as other forms of exclusion and discrimination many individuals and communities continue to experience in the world today. The paroxysm of the 2016 American elections and the consequent normalization of the Islamophobic narrative that has frequently depicted the global community of nearly 2 billion Muslims as violent and monolithic should be a concern to all of us. Othering Muslims through Islamophobic narrative undermines social cohesion in our increasingly diverse societies. As Ahmed has shared, this event is part 1 of the Countering Islamophobia Through Education, a part two series. Today, you will hear 2 presentations, followed by reflections and questions from our discussants, Dr. Firat Kurt, postdoctoral research scholar in the Sakib Subansi Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia University, and Jihad Haj Salem, researcher at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Tunis. Thank you, Firat and Jihad, for being here. My students' interests in countering Islamophobia have emerged during our work in a course on Islam, education, and radicalization that I teach at Columbia University's Graduate School of Education, Health, and Psychology. My own scholarly work centers on changing the broader paradigms or the ways we think about the role of education in social disintegration, Islamophobia, exclusion, corruption, favoritism, and radicalization. This particular course is my effort to catalyze change and examine the true causes of radicalization among youths in hope to prevent it. Among other topics and themes, the course demonstrates the broadening representation and inclusion of Muslims and their voices in the Western context, and particularly in schools, is a prerequisite for social cohesion in our increasingly diverse yet polarized societies. Our first presentation today is titled Countering Islamophobia in the US, a look at Access Islam. It will be delivered by Kendra Burpee, Farial Siddiqui, and Vikramaditya Harshad Joshi. Their presentation is a critique of the US Department of Education funded curriculum called Access Islam that is designed to help students gain awareness and understanding of Islam as a member of a range of diverse faiths. But Kendra, Farial, and Vic's analysis shows that this is far from the case. They offer an insightful examination of the curriculum's strengths and weaknesses and the public criticism Access Islam faced during President Trump's term. They will ultimately offer their own recommendations and insights from best practices in religious education in the US to improve this curriculum. The second presentation, titled Deconstructing International Educational Response to Islamophobia, will be delivered by Mir Sana Ullah Khan, Jody Ghani, Minjung Kang, and Sarah Shongood. In the wake of rising anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiment, this presentation explores public discourse surrounding Islam in the West, along with analyzing educational measures that affect Muslims. Following a brief description of national educational policies in dominant Western countries like France, UK, and the US, Sarah, Jody, Mir, and Minjung attempt to deconstruct and critique international educational guidelines designed to alleviate everyday discrimination faced by Muslim students in the West. They conclude by recommending holistic and representative strategies to counter Islamophobia and its manifestations in educational settings. As we begin our program today, I ask that you please submit your questions throughout our session today. You can use the Q&A button on the Zoom dashboard to submit those questions. And without further ado, I invite Vic, Kendra, and Farial to begin our program. They will share first a positionality statement on behalf of both groups, followed by their presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Before we move into our presentations, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and a positionality statement. Even though much of our learning and work is in the virtual space today, we are privileged and grateful to be students of Columbia University, and thus we would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Lenape people on which we learn and work at Columbia University. Lenape means real person or original person. And it is important to remember that Lenape collectively are a living and breathing community. We honor their legacy and continue to commit ourselves to learning and educating ourselves about the European colonizing forces that have dispossessed the Lenape and other indigenous people of their lands in both local and global contexts. Present in cultural, political, ideological, educational, and economic forms, neo-colonial forces today continue to impact and shape many communities around the world. We invite you to honor the Lenape people with us. And as we meet today on a virtual platform, we invite you to also take a moment to acknowledge the lands and peoples of those lands for wherever you may be situated today. We are committed to working towards social justice by unearthing and improving inequities of all marginalized people to the best of our ability. That is also the purpose of why we are meeting today, to acknowledge and consider how to transform the deep-rooted injustice of Islamophobia. Our classroom environment, cultivated by Professor Amra Sabic-El-Rayess, was characterized by open communication, sincere reflection, the sharing of personal experiences, and the free exchange of ideas. Out of this enriching experience emerged this positionality statement, which we as a class wish to read to introduce a lecture series on preventing Islamophobia through education. As a group of students at Teachers College, Columbia University, we would like to, following from our land acknowledgement, give attention to the following. Although we are presenting under the theme of Islamophobia, we do not claim, nor do we wish to leave an impression that we identify with the Islamophobia experienced by the students and citizens in our presentations. We wish to spotlight the sensitivity of this topic area and hope to meet it with intellectual humility and courage. As students of Columbia University, we firmly believe that it is vital to take note of the privileged platform from which we are speaking and recognize that this privilege is rightly tethered to both a responsibility to our intellectual questions and accountability to those who suffer from Islamophobia in the US, and considering this is Columbia Global Centers, the world. Further, as students of Columbia University's Graduate School of Education, Teachers College, we want to draw attention to the value of the field of education as fertile ground for addressing Islamophobia and encourage researchers in the field of education to continue raising their voices on these issues. We look forward to presenting to all of you today, and thank you for joining us. Now, to briefly introduce ourselves, my name is Vikramaditya Joshi, and I'm a PhD in the Philosophy and Education program at TC.
Hi, my name is Faryal, and I'm a second-year student at Teachers College, and my program is a Master of Arts in International Education Development.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kendra Burpee. I'm also a master's student studying international educational development.
Great. Now I'm just going to share our presentation. Great. So our presentation is entitled Countering Islamophobia in the US, a look at Access Islam. And just to clarify, Access Islam is the curriculum that we will be studying in depth during this presentation. So just to give you a brief outline of the story of our presentation, I will begin with a very brief introduction of the broader landscape of Islamophobia in US classrooms, then move to an introduction of the curriculum itself, and just offer a sense of the lesson plan. Then Kendra will introduce the strengths and weaknesses of the curriculum, talk about the public criticisms as well as the praise the curriculum received. And we will conclude with Faryal, who will talk about the constructive responses to Islamophobia through education and a sampling of the best practices in relation to this. All right, so to begin with a brief story, each frame in this slide will be part of this story. So at the centerfold, you can see the cover of Time magazine. This was in 2010. And the question it's asking is America Islamophobic? Now, through our research and discussions in the class, especially with the current end of the presidential term, the question we feel has shifted to who is America? And that's how we want to center this presentation, by asking ourselves, who is America? Now, if you look on the top right, there's a extract of an article which talks about an incident of Islamophobia in 2015. So in Augusta County in Virginia, a teacher simply tried to educate her students regarding Arabic calligraphy and asked the students to copy some of that calligraphy when they were home for homework. This caused the entire school district to shut down with questions of indoctrination and brainwashing. So this is the context 5 years later. Now, if you look on the left, you have an article published the year after on the chilling rise of Islamophobia in our classrooms in the US specifically, where they talk about bullying and different ways in which Muslim students are being discriminated against and are not able to find spaces to advocate for themselves or even understand their relationship to their own faith and their faith within the American context. You see in the bottom right frame, an actual still of Tucker Carlson's show on the Fox network, which is critiquing the curriculum that we'll be talking about. And this happened just last year. And if any of you are wondering, what is this Runnymede Trust on the top left? That is part of our story, but we won't be going in depth to it. The Runnymede Trust is a left-leaning British think tank. So in the 1990s, they actually produced a landmark study on Islamophobia. And it was that study which actually brought Islamophobia as a term into academic discourse. Now, while we can't get into that topic, we wanted to spotlight the fact that the word Islamophobia itself is a contested term and something which through our studies in this class and beyond, we've been reflecting on. Now, moving to the history of Access Islam as a curriculum. So it was founded in 2005 and it was funded by the US Department of Education. $200,000 in fact was provided by the Bush administration. It is led by and partnered with 13, which is PBS's New York State arm. And the curriculum in terms of its structure is quite simple. It has a video series curated by veteran journalists from CNN, MSNBC, NBC. It has a series of lesson plans, a timeline of the history of Islam, and a set of resources for both teachers and students. Now, thinking about the lesson plan itself, it begins and is very conscious about where it is located. And it introduces Islam as part of a variety of faiths within the secular context in America. And it's very deliberate in this aspect. And it emphasizes things like its relationship to the US Constitution, the First Amendment, and that's the first lesson that's taught as part of the curriculum. In the bottom right, you will see a still from, it's a presentation made by people associated with Access Islam for the state of Georgia, where they took a lot of the schools in the state where the curriculum was introduced, and they talked about this approach of the 3 R's, the rights, responsibilities, and respect. What I wanted to point out is that when they talked about Muslims and the Islamic community in America, they often separated them and in some ways othered them even in their language within the curriculum. Now moving to the lesson plan as a whole and the lesson plans as a whole, as you can see from the flowchart, it's quite a simple structure. You go from information, explanation, and assessment, and you go back to the next lesson. And the only observation I wanted everyone to understand from their lesson plans is that it begins with a lot of abstract information about Islam, the 5 pillars of faith, Hajj and the pilgrimage, and different aspects of the faith. And towards the end of the lesson plan, there are only 10 lessons. It talks more about the role of women in Islam in the contemporary context and the role of Islam in the broader US context. And so that's kind of a brief portrait of the curriculum. And now my colleague Amra will talk about the strengths and weaknesses specifically of Access Islam as a curriculum.
Thank you, Vic. So now I'm going to talk about some of the strengths of Access Islam. As we know, ignorance leads to generalizations about Muslims, especially when Islam is often portrayed only in a negative light in the United States media. This curriculum has many strengths because it focuses on a different side of Islam, one that isn't radical, in order to break down stereotypes and generalizations. First, it does an excellent job of covering this very misunderstood topic. It offers an in-depth introduction for beginners to learn the basic ideas and beliefs and Islamic customs and holidays. Second, it keeps a positive tone throughout and shows the religion in a good light, which is an important difference from how it is often portrayed in the US. It emphasizes variations within Islam and shows that Islam is not a monolithic and uniform religion. There are various moments in the curriculum which show expressions of Islamic faith on a spectrum, of those who are devout to those who are a more balanced expression of their faith. It also has a heavy focus on Islam in America, which is necessary for kids to see and understand that Muslims are their friends and neighbors. It aims to present the facts, which allow students and teachers to interpret the information on their own. No agenda is pushed at them. Lastly, the curriculum includes various resources such as videos and a vocabulary glossary, which allow for asynchronous learning. This could be especially useful during COVID-19 and other remote learning situations where students need to be able to engage with the materials on their own. It's clear that this curriculum has the potential to help combat Islamophobia in schools by preparing youth to become curious instead of fearful about Islam. It helps to reinforce interreligious understanding that helps students, teachers, schools, and communities to become more familiar with the religion. That being said, this curriculum is lacking in a number of key areas. It does not offer enough comparisons with other religions. Although it touches a bit on comparing and contrasting beliefs, we feel it overly stresses the construction of difference and doesn't show enough similarities that children can relate to. As we know, learners are most interested and learn best from topics that they can relate to. It doesn't take risks in addressing misconceptions and misunderstandings of scripture. By avoiding any topic related to political Islam and other controversial issues around the religion, the curriculum keeps a positive tone, but doesn't offer students the chance to critically analyze, nor to understand all of the many misconceptions. It does not thoroughly discuss negative experiences of Muslims in the United States, which is so important for students to understand if one of the goals of this curriculum is to combat Islamophobia. Exposure to the lived experiences of American Muslims is so important in stimulating religious understanding. Learning about these misconceptions and experiences should go hand in hand with the lessons about systemic racism in the United States and America's history of colonialism. The target audience for the curriculum is 4th grade to 8th grade. A curriculum that's this important can't possibly be appropriate for that large of an age range. 4th graders are very different learners from 8th graders. Lastly, although the curriculum contains different types of resources such as videos, the content seems a bit dull and outdated. Students will likely be bored and not engaged at points. Even though it is good to teach the facts, we worry that there won't be opportunities for higher order thinking that encourages curiosity. There have been significant negative reactions to Access Islam over the years. The Christian Action Network made a video calling out the US Department of Education for promoting an Islamic indoctrination program. The video claims that this curriculum is basically a Sunday school class for Islam. They say it's not right that other religions don't have a curriculum focused on them. Fox News called Access Islam a thinly veiled pro-Islam propaganda. Talking on Fox News, the founder of the Christian Action Network asked suspiciously, why does the federal government find it necessary that our kids know what a Muslim prayer sounds like? The Christian Action Network used a legal letter of demand asking the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, to remove the material from public school use and to declare the program a violation of the US Constitution. 16,738 people signed this petition online. These reactions show the level of anti-Islam hysteria in this country, that what is a simple school curriculum teaching in a straightforward way about a religion makes people feel threatened. But some reactions have been more positive. Linda Wertheimer, journalist and author of the book Faith Education, Teaching About Religion in an Age of Intolerance, defended the curriculum, saying, Access Islam is not preaching or promoting Islam over other faiths. In fact, the lesson plans include questions about comparing and contrasting beliefs and practices of Islam to those of other faiths. The director of Harvard Divinity School's Religious Literacy Project, Diane Moore, also said, "It is so important to make the distinction between teaching about a religion and teaching religion. And the Access Islam site makes this distinction in its first lesson on the First Amendment." In a 2015 article discussing confronting stereotypes about Muslims and countering xenophobia, the New York Times listed Access Islam as a valuable resource with reliable information for readers to educate themselves about Muslims and Islam. So it is clear that despite all of the criticisms, some feel that the program is a very appropriate and effective way for people to gain a broad understanding of the religion, and that this basic understanding could in turn lead to countering xenophobia and Islamophobia. Now my colleague Fariel will be discussing some recommendations and best practices.
Thank you, Kendra, for that lovely presentation. So I'm going to be taking you through some of the recommendations and best practices that we felt were important to point out if curriculums like Access Islam were, to me, made better or more implementable in an environment in the, like a diverse environment like the United States. So the recommendations are based on our personal observations, and they're also key takeaways that we've had from the Religious and Diversity Education Program that was created by the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding and is administered in the United States. So the first point that has also been pointed out in the weaknesses is that the curriculum needs to have a more specific target audience. What do we mean by that is that the curriculum right now is tending to a very large group of students, which is from grade 4 to grade 12, which in terms of pedagogy or learning techniques is not optimal for a student's learning. The curriculum, so for instance, students from higher classes might find the curriculum too simplistic or may lose interest, or students from lower classes or younger students might find it very challenging or difficult to follow. So in light of this, the curriculum needs to be altered to suit the learning potential of students with each grade and revise the content, the assessment and activities, assessing the learning competencies of students with each grade. In line of this, the idea that we had was maybe focus on the technique called spiral curriculum, where you build on foundational concepts, but making them harder or more comprehensive in line with the learning abilities of students with each grade, and also inculcating and making room for higher order thinking skills for students in higher grades. The second point that we wanted to highlight was that the curriculum needs to be implemented from an earlier age. So the standard curriculum that we're looking at, the Religious and Diversity Education Program, is also implemented at the elementary school level. Why is this important? Is because research has shown that young children are impressionable and have the ability to form concrete beliefs from a very early age. The research that we went through showed that in children from a very early age understand the concept of race and start forming perceptions of who they belong to, the race that they belong to, and who is the other. And there was a research study that showed that children can exhibit racist attitudes as early as preschool, while another study showed that even toddlers can have negative prejudices when they're living in context with clear ethnic friction. So keeping this in mind, it is important to educate students about these important social values, about religious pluralism and acceptance in diverse communities from an early age, especially because they grow up in these diverse communities. And interreligious education at an early age can help them form foundational concepts of the self, of the community, of diversity and culture in a more comprehensive and useful manner. Next slide, please. The third point that we wanted to highlight was that the curriculum needs to be more contextually relevant with more in-depth knowledge of Islam, Islamophobia, and I wanted to sort of tackle this in light of 2 points that we had in mind. So the students I feel like the curriculum directly delves into the content of what Islam is about in terms of the practices that Muslims follow, and gives just an introduction in terms of the First Amendment. However, there is a dire need to the students need to understand why they need to study this curriculum in the first place in light of important terms like prejudice and stereotypes. There needs to be a clear explanation and understanding of these terms, and to set a foundation for students to understand why it is important for them to study this curriculum in the first place. Second, we felt that the curriculum was a little safe in highlighting sensitive information, and there need to be more concrete examples to address the negative experiences of Muslims with respect to the religious prejudice and stereotypes that they face in the West, specifically in the United States, that can have long-lasting impacts on their on their living in these environments in the West, and on their upbringing, and basically taking over most of their life. The fourth point that we wanted to look at was, and this is more in line with inculcating the curriculum, the content of the curriculum, was that instead of teaching Islam in isolation, there needs the knowledge should be integrated into the broader curriculum. So we saw before, as Kendra pointed out, that Access Islam faced considerable backlash for being unconstitutional and promoting a single religion and indoctrinating Islam. And therefore, I feel when you teach Islam in isolation to students in the West, there is always first there it puts unwanted spotlight on Muslim students, and it also creates room for more anti-Islamic sentiment. So there has been research that shows that interreligious teaching is most effective when integrated into the broader curriculum. So, and the Tannenbaum Center also incorporates interfaith knowledge within subjects like math, social studies, etc., at the elementary level of schooling. This is a more effective way of teaching about Islam, because the broader curriculum teaches them about not just Islam, but also other cultures, and helps them better adapt to living in a pluralistic society. Another point that it becomes important to inculcate Islamic knowledge within the broader curriculum, along with other religions or cultures that are prevalent in the United States. It would help sort of diminish Muslims as being presented as the prime other, but rather as one of the other religions that is present in the US among many other religions that are present in the diverse community. The fifth point that we felt was important to point out was that in terms of learning activities, there was more room for practices like group work and discussion with peers. Why is this important? Is because research indicates that with students learn a lot more in collaborative settings, in cooperative learning environments, and have the opportunity to exchange and express views and perspectives, which can be very effective in reducing prejudice in the youth. These kind of settings are much more effective than the instructor-led classrooms, because it gives the student a platform to become the student and the learner at the same time. This is also important. So it becomes an important opportunity for students to learn from one another. Through these exercises, students can also gain important skills with regards to communicating in different diverse environments and diverse settings, and be able to have meaningful conversations that would help them build these skills in the global setting and the multicultural democracy that they live in. Lastly, the point that we wanted to emphasize was that, again, the curriculum, as it was working under the assumption that students knew about terms like prejudice and stereotypes, is also working under the assumption that teachers are well trained and have the requisite knowledge to implement this kind of curriculum. Looking at the Access Islam website, the website only spoke about how the materials or the inventory that teachers needed to execute the lesson, but did not focus on the kind of knowledge that they need in order to sort of execute this curriculum, which is of a different nature. So it's important that, and we also feel that most of the teachers that will be implementing this curriculum in a context like the United States might not be Muslim, and might actually belong to other religions, or be a part of the dominant West. So it is important that they undergo specialized anti-bias training in terms of acknowledging their own biases that they might have, and and not reinforce them in the classroom. And they also need to have conflict resolution training, because this is sensitive information that we are imparting to students, and there is always room for conflict and there is always room for argument. So it's important that classroom environments are made conducive to learning with healthy communication and healthy arguments, but not in a way that hampers learning, and teachers need to be able to manage those kind of settings. And with that, we would like to thank you for giving us this platform to present our findings, and we would love to answer any questions that you might have later on after our colleagues present. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vic, Kendra, and Ferial for your insightful presentation. Now I would like to invite Jody, Mir, Sarah, and Minjung to start with their presentation at this time.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm a graduate student focusing on peace and human rights education.
Hello, my name is Minjung. I'm a second year studying Masters in Economics and Education at Columbia TC.
Hi, I'm Jyoti and I'm a graduate student at Teachers College, Columbia, and I'm pursuing my graduate degree in International Education Development.
Hi, my name is Mir Sanaullah Khan, and I'm a first-year graduate student at the Department of Curriculum and Teaching at Teachers College, Columbia University.
Hello and happy Friday. Our presentation will be focusing on deconstructing educational responses to Islamophobia in the West. Our agenda will consist of defining Islamophobia, public discourse surrounding Muslims in the West, an educational response, national and international, analyzing the international educational response, and recommendations. I have provided a definition of what Islamophobia is. Islamophobia is an exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostility toward Islam and Muslims that is perpetrated by negative stereotypes resulting in bias, discrimination, and the marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from social, political, and civil life. I'm going to discuss 6 common stereotypes seen in the Western world regarding Muslims. The first stereotype is that they are all the same. Muslims are seen to be homogeneous. They lack diversity in national, cultural, ethnic, and political outlooks. They are seen to be lying on the same spectrum as far as religious observance goes. The second is that they are motivated by religion. It is believed that religion drives all decisions made by Muslims by the same logic. If a Muslim engages in violence, it is assumed to be driven by religious motives. The third is that Muslims are the other. Muslims are assumed to have no needs, interests, and values in common with the rest of the world. This assumption leads to the assumption that Muslims do not hold any insights or wisdom which may benefit the rest of the world. The fourth stereotype is that they are culturally and morally inferior. Muslims are seen as culturally and morally inferior and prone to being irrational and violent, intolerant of their treatment of women, contemptuous towards worldviews different from their own, and hostile and resentful towards the West for no good reason. The fifth stereotype is that they are seen as a threat. Muslims are seen as a security threat. Globally, they are engaged in a class of civilizations. And within those countries where they make up a minority, they are an enemy within, in tactic or open sympathy with international terrorism and bent on the Islamization of the countries where they live. The sixth stereotype is that they are non-cooperative. As a consequence of the previous 5 perceptions, it is claimed that there is no possibility of active partnership between Muslims and people with different religious or cultural backgrounds, working as equals on tasks that require dialogue and patient negotiation. Islamophobia has reached some of the highest offices and governments in the world. I'm going to share some of the dangerous rhetoric seen in France, the United States, and the United Kingdom today. President Emmanuel Macron of France has used diversionary tactics, such as the stigmatization of Muslims, and has used the term Islam separatism, which is a textbook example of othering. President Donald J. Trump of the United States has went as far as targeting Muslim congresswomen. For anyone not familiar with the United States government, Congress is one of the highest offices, and only 3 Muslims currently serve in Congress. Trump insinuates that they are disloyal to the country and purposefully incites fear into the public. This has resulted in death threats to the 2 congresswomen, Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib. Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom has fueled Islamophobia, and today far-right activists in the United Kingdom are spreading a dangerous conspiracy that Muslims are spreading COVID-19 and depicting them as a parasitical to their society. Since these three Western countries have had strong public discourse surrounding Islam, we are now going to review how their national educational policies affect Muslims. My colleague Ming Jing will take it from here and discuss different approaches to multiculturalism.
Thanks, Sarah. Now we are going to talk about how Western countries such as France, Britain, and the US have been trying to integrate Muslim students into their school system at the national level. And then we will discuss the approach by the ideals. France uses an egalitarianism approach that rejects additional cultural loyalties that may compete with the French Republic. And Britain uses multiculturalism approach, and its policies are designed to respect diverse cultural identities. The US society is made up of different racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural groups, which has been fostering the integration of diverse communities. Next slide, please. In France, the education system is under the central authority, and its curriculums and objects follow the national rules. By the national guidelines, citizens are free to have any religion in the private space, but cannot display any membership in the public space. For that reason, religious diversity in France remains limited in school systems. For instance, Islam is only being taught through a historical teaching approach in public education system. Next slide, please. In Britain, each local authority and schools are free to adapt their own curriculum as well as other programs to meet the local educational needs. Schools are allowed to decide their own class costs, and a law was passed in 1944 to allow students to excuse from attendance for a religious holiday. And public schools provide Islam as an academic subject and train teachers through the comparative study. And here in the United States, the next slide, please. We have a strong judicial tradition of defending religious freedom, which has been fostering the integration of religious and cultural minorities, including Muslim. So it has been the goal for educators to promote multiculturalism in the school curriculum. However, similar to France, public schools in the States do not offer a subject of a specific religion. Many Western countries such as US, Britain, and France have been approaching the issue of the integration of Muslims through various educational policy. Yet it is widely understood that those approaches need to be supplemented and further studied. The important step is change the way Islam is treated in school curriculums. So next slide, please. So there have been international response on this matter, and the issue has been big enough to warrant the attention and the action from IGO, particularly the UN. For instance, UNESCO offers countermeasure or guideline on the issue of Islamophobia under the broader umbrella of intolerance such as racism and xenophobia. Briefly, the UNESCO guideline includes a human rights-based approach, participatory approach, and teaching of religion and cultural approach, and more. These approaches require a significant support and encouragement of policymakers and educational administrators. And its policy analysis suggests ways to address Islamophobia through education within a human rights framework. So next, Jody is going to discuss the analysis on teacher guideline for intolerance by UNESCO.
Thanks, Minjung. So in the interest of time, we're only going to talk about the international response to countering Islamophobia. And the first thing that we looked at was representation. The list of experts and consultants who've contributed to this curriculum lacks representation from Islamic scholars or organizations. The list has a total of 3 Muslim contributors, which constitutes less than 15% of the total expert panel. And these people have been trained largely in the West on larger political issues instead of focusing on Islamic epistemology or culture. When we compare the document to the preceding document or guideline in UNESCO's Intolerance Series, which was countering anti-Semitism through education, the guideline on Islamophobia seemed rather generalized and vague. The anti-Semitism curriculum is highly graded, and it has topics defined and explained in detail. It also has operational definitions for several terms associated with anti-Semitism in the West. The curriculum there also engages the topic of discrimination against Jewish individuals and societies across history, current events, and public discourse, something that we did not find in this guideline. Another issue that we noticed was that this guideline integrates Islamophobia under the broad umbrella of racism, xenophobia, and intolerance, instead of addressing it as a distinct problem. Islamophobia in this guideline is not defined or seen as a novel problem. Instead, the focus is on how it may be a combination of other discriminatory practices that already exist in the world. Next slide, please. We also noticed that human rights education, or HRE, is used as a definite approach rather than a framework for countering Islamophobia. Since the problem of Islamophobia and the public discourse surrounding it have been very subject-specific and context-specific, the human rights education framework seems rather universal as a methodology to address it. However, if we use the human rights education framework loosely and make it more context-specific to Islamophobia, with HRE integrated within it, it can perhaps yield better dialogue and results when it comes to countering Islamophobia. The pedagogical approach that is promoted in this guideline is participatory dialogue and dialogical studies. However, it does not pay attention to the socio-cultural factors that may lead to less representation of Muslim students in said dialogue. We know that Muslim students, owing to a lot of cultural and religious values, may not be comfortable with actively participating in dialogue relating to stereotypes surrounding them. Moreover, their vulnerable status may also hinder participation due to a fear of bullying and discrimination from peers and other stakeholders within their learning communities. This document should perhaps include the role of a teacher as a counselor and how they can help Muslim students bring their voices to the fore before moving on to recommending participatory dialogue within classrooms. Another thing that we notice that this guideline might promote subtle othering because it only addresses how to direct interaction towards Muslim students instead of incorporating strategies which might help Muslim students deal with everyday issues. Islamophobia, as we know, is an issue that extends beyond its manifestations of verbal, emotional, or physical abuse that students might face within their learning communities. This guideline, we observe, might have a little binary approach or may promote binarism because it promotes how students and teachers should interact with Muslims rather than how Muslims can express their identity or communicate it in the larger social fabric of the communities in which they reside. Next slide, please. We also noticed that the curriculum actually had some very strong points. The section that deals with activities to promote critical reflection and thinking are very strong, and they are good starting points for engaging students in context-specific dialogue. The resources that are provided in the document are also very rich and can help Muslim students navigate their identity within their Western learning communities. This can also be a useful guide for teachers in starting discussions or initiating their own knowledge when it comes to their student bodies. Overall, the comparative analysis that we conducted showed that the guideline perhaps addresses only symptoms of Islamophobia, but ignores delving into the problem in terms of context, culture, and history. Next up, Mir is going to discuss some recommendations that we as a group thought could promote a more holistic approach towards countering Islamophobia.
Thank you, Jyoti. Our recommendations are broad, but they're very basic and they're interconnected. I'll start with this very important recommendation of dismantling Orientalism in discourses on Islamophobia. Now, as we talked about, one must be wary of the positionality of the authors creating the discourse on Islamophobia. We know that Western scholarship creates Oriental images of Muslims in discourse as the other, which have consequences for Muslims in real life. This Oriental discourse is powerful because of its close ties to state institutions and civil society, schools, institutions, media. Orientalist knowledge is thus multiplied and spread into the general culture. And in doing so, Orientalism normalizes in public consciousness the image of a superior West in relation to an inferior East. One of the most common trope that is found in this discourse is that of the binarism. I'm sure you've all heard of the racist logic. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. Now, this displacement of terrorists with Muslims and Muslims with Arabs manifests as counter-terrorists, that is the us or the self, versus the terrorists, that is the them or the others. This discourse allows Western intellectuals like Bernard Lewis to come and present Muslims like a single blob of 1 billion people, as he did in Islam in the West. It allows intellectuals like Samuel Jackson to come and preach ideas of the clash of civilizations, essentially saying Islam and the West are at war with each other. These ideas, they serve as a form of control and domination. They take away the humanity of Muslims, and when Muslims are dehumanized, all kinds of oppression against them seem justified. Therefore, we feel that Muslims as the other created by this course must be dismantled to truly address the problem. Next slide, please. Okay, now how should we go about it? We know that schools are a central site for legitimization of myths about non-Western, often non-Christian people, because the majority of educators in the West are white, monolingual, and middle class, and often have had minimal contact with people unlike themselves. Teachers, curriculum developers, they would likely not have had perhaps any significant or intimate interactions with culturally or linguistically diverse children prior to seeing them in their classrooms. It should be no surprise then that too much of the work that we talked about above in the name of multicultural curriculum, when it is present, is superficial, fragmented, and often decontextualized. And it is offered by teachers who have had little preparation in either the content or the pedagogy of cultural relevance, who therefore can do little more than reinforce a tokenized perspective of quote unquote minorities in this country, often through an emphasis on celebrations, contributions, food, and heroes. Therefore, we feel that any serious attempt to undertake, countering Islamophobia in education must take into account the power difference that exists in the Western Islamic interactions and its portrayal in education. It must nurture a critical sense of empathy, including an understanding of Muslims' fears, anxieties, and frustrations. Next slide, please. We talked about some stereotypes at the beginning of this presentation, and we want to offer a counter on how to some recommendations on how to counter them. What should the culturally responsive pedagogy that we talked about teach? Well, first of all, we should teach the children that there has been always been diversity, debate, and internal deliberation within Islam, and that people of Muslim background have a range of different attitudes toward religion and practice, as do people born into other traditions. The next one is that that Muslims and people with different religious or cultural backgrounds have a great deal in common with the rest of the world. that people belonging to religious or cultural communities, including Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others, have lived in close harmony with each other and still do today, and that Islamic culture and civilization has had substantial contribution over the centuries to science and technology, the arts, architecture, law, ethics, and philosophy. To sum it up, what we are saying basically is that any future attempts at combating Islamophobia in the West through education and otherwise must include Muslim voices. It must take into account the social, emotional, and psychological effects of Islamophobia on Muslim students and provide dedicated resources to mitigate its effect. That will be our presentation. Thank you so much. It's been an honor for me and my colleagues to present in front of you.
Thank you so much to our second group of presenters. Now that we have heard these two incredibly insightful presentations, I would like to first invite Firat, our first discussant, and then Jihad to share their reflections and pose questions to both groups. And after their questions, we will begin to address some of the questions, very interesting questions I have to say, that have come through from the audience during the presentations. And again, if you haven't posed your question as of yet, you can use the Q&A button on the Zoom dashboard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking at my notes. Thank you so much for such fantastic presentations. I learned a lot, and I ask your permission for any question that that might be part of my ignorance or pedagogical disorientation, because this is also kind of new field for me, but it was also very enlightening. As part of my reflection throughout your presentation, I got that understanding Islamophobia in a sense requires us a kind of shift, performing a shift from the individual and particular events, and see how this question is connected to longer history of exclusion of marginalized people in general, and the complicity of liberal capitalism and the structure of violence in the global north at large. And the spirit of international solidarity and progressive politics and critical scholarship, I find both presentations utterly timely and significant interventions. I'm a political anthropologist, so pedagogy is not my forte. It's not my expertise, but I find Jacques Rancière especially important in understanding how the relationship between politics and pedagogy can be taught. In his famous book titled The Ignorant Schoolmaster, Rancière puts forward a rather provocative assertion. It is possible, he claims, and not only possible, even emancipatory and progressively desirable, that teachers may not know what they do teach. Now, the following historical and philosophical debates, he shows us that teaching and learning in general are collective practices. So it's going far beyond classical dichotomy between omniscient and wise philosopher, old male professor, and ignorant and unrefined students. So in this sense, learning is always a kind of collective activity in which both parties engage in the question at hand, transform themselves in a dialectical fashion during this process. In this sense, the authority is not at the hand of the teacher, and we learn from them like impassively, but our primary task is to enhance solidarity, inequality, our mutual dependence, and our infinite capacity to ask questions and learn things, partake in engagements, social and political engagements. So I cannot imagine a better way to perform such revolutionary pedagogical practice that Rancière argues than asking questions about Islamophobia in the West and collective hysteria about Muslim so-called terrorist and political legitimacy of racism, populist discourse about racism and discrimination, and even the violence with impunity in the last the events showed us in the United States. So marginalization, exclusion and discrimination, racism and radicalization have emerged as major themes during presentations with critical insight. Both of our panel groups give us some insights about how de-radicalization can be conceived as a double-sided process. It's not only related to at-risk Muslim youth, but also it's a kind of upper middle class Westerners. In this sense, de-radicalization gives us some hints about shifting the terrain from Islamic quote-unquote radicalization to other terrains, liberal conformism, market fundamentalism, racial gradations, or like male chauvinism that last time we saw in the Donald Trump case so obnoxiously. So culturally responsive pedagogy aims at shifting this terrain and thus partake in cultivating the critical capacities for young people. Like in the primary school or high school is of course like radically different, and I don't know what kind of different pedagogies requires, but still it's a kind of the critical capacity is a kind of at the heart of the question, I believe. So critical thinking, as I understand, as a kind of intellectual labor in investigating the immanent limitations of our thinking and practices. In a sense, it's like it's a kind of every critical effort is a kind of critical effort dedicated to our own positionality, our own self-criticism. So the contemporary world, unfortunately, in this sense, becoming more and more anti-critical, indulging in a kind of affective enjoyment, dogmatic politics, and populist righteousness that many people feel, especially the majority, as the source of all values and truths without question and with impunity. While critical engagement requires a kind of institutional context, pedagogically oriented criticism cannot be subjected to institutional authority, as perfectly demonstrated in the case of Access Islam curriculum, that the curriculum itself is also a kind of limiting framework that disallows us to engage in kind of deep and more profound manners of critical thinking. So new forms of institutional frameworks might need for us to develop and engage in our battle against Islamophobic thinking. So in this light of my understanding, limited understanding, I want to ask two questions, one per each, as usual. The first one is like for our first group is like that is I think that even in a kind of curriculum, Access Islam or otherwise, there is a danger of objectifying Islam, meaning that making it dehumanizing by asking the question what it is, because what it is, it implies that there's a kind of essential, substantial core of Islam that remain unchanged. Unfortunately, we know from social sciences and history, this is not the case. So there is a kind of interdisciplinary complication. It's like history, social sciences, and philosophy. And what do you think about the possibilities of expanding our such curriculums to interdisciplinary backgrounds? Like, what are the possible cooperations between different classes or different curriculums and lessons? The other question is like, again, related to contextualizing Islam, but operating in international settings. So while thinking about how to educate people about like Islamophobia, is there a kind of, as far as you could discern, as a kind of educating the educator themselves? Because university education is the part, we assume that like teachers somehow inherently anti-Islamophobic and they can easily implement these projects, but I'm not very sure that that would be the case in Turkey, or like in Turkey, different ways, but like in France, in Britain, or United States. So are that the kind of university curriculum for training teachers through, again, an interdisciplinary project like contextualizing Islam and providing a kind of understanding for the teachers themselves, the complicatedness and complexity of question at hand? These are my two simple questions.
So I would just invite group one to perhaps address some of the thoughts and a really insightful reflection on your work, and perhaps then group number two can address the aspects that are relevant to their presentation that can add value to this discussion. And again, Firat, thank you for that wonderful reflection. So group one.
Yeah, Dr. Kurt, thank you so much for that reflection. And I'd say that two parts of it which I'd want to address. One, I really do appreciate the interdisciplinary point you're making about religion, about, I'm a student of philosophy, so about philosophy and the different aspects of the study of religion. And I think that's something which we did not see in the literature, that religion is separated as a curriculum and then taught as one thing. So there is a need to even think about religion as a subject area that's meeting at the cross section of a variety of fields, right? And I think that that's something which I would definitely reflect and agree upon. And I would say though, to offer one strength of the curriculum, and just to give a specific example for both yourself and our audience, I think a good example of what the curriculum was trying to do is, like, for example, in their prayer lesson on prayer, they talked about prayer as a shared component of all major world religions. So that was a very insightful way to introduce a specific practice towards this faith as a shared component of all faiths. So now, whether you're a Muslim student or a Jewish student or a Christian student in the classroom, you recognize the ritual as shared, but the significance of that ritual may have a different narrative to which you're attending to it. So I think there are those gems in it, but unfortunately they're just gems. And then the larger ideological kind of focus wasn't addressed. But I think it's I think your question itself is one that needs to be asked again and again. I think it's asked once, a curriculum is made, and it's not revisited. And I think that feedback loop needs to happen so we actually see a shift and not just an intervention, right? So a shift and not just an intervention. But yeah, thank you for the question.
I just wanted to say that I don't know if I'm addressing the question directly, but with respect to the other curriculum that we were looking at, which I referred to in the recommendations, I actually kind of looking at Access Islam kind of resonated with the idea that you're talking about, how dehumanizing it kind of was, because it was just focusing on what kind of Muslims are expected to do in terms of like practices, but less catered towards their experiences or what kind of daily challenges they might have living in the West. So one of the things that I appreciated about the other curriculum, and which might be relevant in terms of expanding the learning, was how knowledge was integrated into the broader curriculum in ways like they'd have activities where students from a younger age would be expected to maybe create, I think this was one of the chapters in the science curriculum where students were expected to sort of create a diet plan for an Olympic athlete, and they were asked that, oh, if the Olympic athlete per se follows a Jewish faith, or if they follow an Islamic faith, how do you think that, how would you tailor it to? So in that sense, they were also integrating religious knowledge as well, and also sort of inculcating like a more, I don't know if this is interdisciplinary, but I think it was done in a more, in a way that was more receptive to the students, and I think it was a better way of tackling it.
And along with that, Access Islam does a good job of counteracting the misconceptions by teaching the facts, but religious literacy is just one part of the puzzle that can combat Islamophobia. Having a basic understanding of Islamic prayers and holidays doesn't necessarily stop discrimination and prejudice, especially when kids look outside everywhere and they're seeing these harmful representations of Islam. So I agree that this is where a more interdisciplinary approach could be effective in contextualizing Islam.
Regarding the question with the role of the teacher as an elevated or knowledgeable authority, part of the reason we chose a UNESCO guideline for teachers was because we wanted to study how teachers are perceived, or how they have to deal with Muslim students or generally a diverse student body. And part of the reason we also included culturally responsive pedagogy as our recommendation was that they're not really vessels of transmission. It is a collaborative process through which education is constructed, and students and teachers get to understand each other better. Our analysis also noticed how there is a lack of dialogue between the teacher and the student in terms of teachers understanding the realities that are faced by their students on a daily basis, and a recommendation for a more collaborative and deliberative approach when it comes to the role of a teacher within a classroom. I think it was Mir who noted that most teachers practicing education in Europe are monolingual, are Caucasian, and might not encounter diversity outside of their classroom. So it is perhaps a responsibility of an instructor to educate themselves and remove the binary or othering that they might implicitly encounter in their practice of teaching, which is something that culturally responsive pedagogy can promote because it focuses on a critical reflection and also collaborative learning, which engages students and teachers both in the process of learning rather than it being a one-way transmission.
Thank you so much for those informative responses that make me proud to be a teacher to this wonderful group of students. I would like to, I know that we are running over time, but we've gotten a permission to go up to 10:30. So I would like to invite Jihad to share his reflection and questions, and hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes for the questions from the audience. So Jihad.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Amra. And I would like to thank both groups of their wonderful presentations. They have been so enlightening for me, for someone who is working on the other spectrum of radicalization, radicalization related to forms of militant political Islam. So I have two quick and broad reflections on the presentation. The first one related to Access Islam. I would share the reflection that somehow the curriculum seemed to me as if it's picturing another stereotype about Islam. It's a more good stereotype about Islam, and proposing that stereotype as countering the other negative stereotype of Islam. While the matter for me looks is if it was better to de-essentialize Islam and try to enlighten or highlight the diversity within Islam. That's one. Two, the curriculum also try to picture Islam as, or capture Islam as a religion, while Islam is more than that. Islam is a civilization, because right now in the Muslim world, a lot of people, they do not identify as Muslims, as religious people, as religious Muslims. They identify themselves as cultural Muslims, or being Muslims by being a part of a large civilization from Pakistan to North Africa. So that's one. So I would like to ask the question, does this part was present in the curriculum or not? Because by restricting Islam to its religious core, and especially its ritualistic core, the prayer, the fast, the holidays, etc. And by the way, there is a lot of diversity even in the ritual practices of Islam, because Shiite Islam, Muslims, they do not perform the prayer as Sunni Muslims. And even within Sunni Islam, within the four schools of jurisprudence, there is diversity and difference in the ways we perform the prayer itself. In Tunisia, for example, the call for the prayer is different than the call for the prayer in Syria. So because we have different school of Islamic jurisprudence. So that kind of diversity, was it pictured in the curriculum or not? And if not, how does that impact actually the learning process, the type of knowledge that the curriculum is transmitting to students about Islam? So that's one. Two, the second question is about as far as it seemed to me that there is a lot about Islam in those curriculums, more than about the phobia of Islam itself. So did the curriculums actually target the phobia, the stereotypes, negative stereotypes, all the dynamics, political, cultural dynamics that are shaping that phobia of Islam? For example, today, the issue of immigration, we cannot talk about Islamophobia without talking about immigration in France. for example. We cannot talk about Islamophobia without talking about the history of colonialism. So in France, for example, all the discussions or debates, public debates about Islam and the integration of Muslims and migrants, etc., is related to either migration, immigration, or to colonialism, to the history of France and North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, etc. So to what extent, my question to the second group of students, to the second presenters, to what extent those curriculums try to talk about phobia and to deconstruct phobia by presenting or picturing the complex dynamics that are shaping that phobia more than talking about Islam itself. So yeah.
So the short answer to your first question is no. Access Islam very much was a curriculum that showed the facts. It showed it as a religion, and it did not go into about community and culture. What it did do for diversity was it emphasized the variations in some way, in that it showed in various moments how different expressions of Islamic faith are on a spectrum, from people who are more devout to people who have a more balanced expression of their faith. And it did have a focus on Islam in America, which is important. But I agree with your criticism that Islam should have been portrayed more as a community and culture. And to your second question in regards to the curriculum Access Islam, in this presentation, we are talking about the curriculum as a way to combat Islamophobia, but that's not how it was presented by the US Department of Education. It was presented as a straightforward curriculum to teach about a religion. We are just interpreting it as a way, something that could be used to combat Islamophobia, but the curriculum does not talk about the phobia of Islam. It doesn't go enough into misconceptions and the different experiences, negative experiences that Muslims deal with in regards to stereotypes in the United States and worldwide.
Also, very briefly, I will add that I think your question highlights that we should just be very blunt and say that a lot of these curriculums, they simplify Islam, right? Like it's a function of the curriculum, right? It's not a good function. And the second thing I will say is that even though in our research, and I know Kendra and Faryal will attest to this, we kept wondering, is this the gold standard? How can this be the curriculum that the New York Times and will put on its website as like a very good resource for students and teachers, right? So clearly there's a lot of work to be done. And I think both yours and Dr. Kurt's reflections are highlighting that if this is where we're at 2020, there's a long road ahead. So yeah.
Thank you, Jihad, for that thoughtful reflection. And my students.
I'll go for our group.
Oh, go ahead, Mir.
In short, no. One of our main criticisms is that these guidelines, they take away from the political and historical roots of the problem. They don't say why Islamophobia exists. I mean, the UNESCO guidelines for teachers, they were addressing the problems as a human rights problem. They paint it with a broad brush. If we respect human rights, if everybody knows their rights, then there would be no Islamophobia problem. I mean, they talk about Islam, but they do not know why it exists and what it achieves for the West and for the imperial powers.
Thank you for that, Mir. As reflected in the fact that we are so over time and we haven't gotten to so many questions that we've gotten from the audience, it is abundantly clear that conversations that we are having today are lacking in the larger discourse, not only in politics, sociology, psychology, but also clearly in education. And that is really one of the most compelling reasons, or was one of the most compelling reasons for me to create this course at the Graduate School of Education in Islam Education and Radicalization, to begin to open the doors to having these types of complicated conversations. As Jihad has mentioned, there there are multifaceted problems that are funneled into answering the question how we address Islamophobia. And that is something that we do throughout the entire course at Columbia through the semester. And obviously what you have heard today from my students is only a subsegment of those really rich and important discussions. And with that, we have gotten permission to go to 10:45 because I really wanted to have an opportunity for us to address some of these questions from the audience. And many of them are really expanding discussion and raising an issue of, should we think beyond formal education? Should we think beyond teachers in schools? Because this is, as has been clearly said by everyone involved, a societal, larger societal issue that should matter to all of our societies, not only to subgroups of Muslims. And so with that, I will try to pose several questions, and please feel free for both groups to come in as you have thoughts to add to our discussion. So one question is, to combat Islamophobia, how can the number of content moderators knowledgeable about Islam be increased at social media companies? And related to that, perhaps, is who are the top 5 male and female role models? More online content on that is needed. I welcome anyone to start with their reflections or answering these 2 questions. So how do we incorporate social media and go beyond education? And can we partner as stakeholders in the formal education? Can we partner with social media, with entertainment industry, with other industries in our societies to have a larger impact of how Muslims are depicted and perceived and how they're other than feared? Anyone?
Yeah, I'm happy to begin, and I'll pass to Jyoti. I saw you unmute. I'll begin by saying that I think both our presentations shared one component for the teacher, which is there seems to be a misunderstanding to the students' fundamental reality. And the students' reality is nowadays that social media is part of their literacy, part of what they're reading, part of where they're seeing a lot of what we're talking about actually occur. So I would say that consistent with both the recommendations, there needs to be an acknowledgement and an embrace of a lot of the content which would be deemed controversial or uncomfortable. And the way that's handled needs to be done with care and sensitivity, but ignoring that kind of content is not, I don't think, a viable solution to actually see the ground reality for students today. And to the second point, I think for role models, I know that I don't know how many in our audience would know, say, Dr. Hawa Abdi, for example, a Somali doctor who was nominated for a prestigious prize and actually has been a great female Muslim icon for a lot of people, both in the healthcare community, but also at large, but unfortunately hasn't been picked up by a lot of mainstream outlets and news outlets. So you don't actually see her name as much. Of course, we know Malala Yousafzai, of course, but that's an icon who has gone to the late shows and has had that kind of global audience. But there are many others who I don't think get the spotlight that they deserve. But they're out there. We just have to look harder. But yeah.
And I think it deals primarily with the issue of, say, representation within the larger public discourse. When we talk about, say, top 5 Muslim role models, that is, again, I think a little essentialist, because the whole theme with our presentations is to be very context specific, very culturally driven. So when you're deciding role models for your learners, the primary factor is that they should be relatable. So when you're discussing role models, and the onus is on the teacher to find out relatable figures or identities that students can identify or relate to and perhaps even look up to. And when it comes to talking about, say, the influence of social media and collaboration, then I think there's a need to deconstruct like the transmission, because we usually see social media as influencing students. However, we know that they're very consumer driven. So if we are creating critical consumers in our learning communities, then transmission kind of goes both ways. So if our students are not receptive to, say, myths or stereotypes that surround Muslims or Islam or the Islamic communities, then I believe that the collaboration will yield better results, because then there will be no demand for the products or, say, rhetoric that kind of demeans them.
I think I just want to second what Jyoti said in terms of that rather than focusing on social media outlets, which, as she said, are driven by consumer demand, it's more important to have a institutionalized response to it, where you equip your students to critically engage with this kind of material and understand where maybe they can question where they feel like what is right and what is wrong and how they have to approach it. So I think more than social media outlets, it's maybe curriculums like Access Islam which are not working, which is why there are students who are more receptive to this kind of Islamophobic rhetoric on social media.
As was said, so much of the issue is how media outlets depict Muslims negatively. And I think it would definitely be a good idea to utilize social media and the entertainment industry to change how Islam is portrayed. And I agree with who asked this question, that having diversity and representation in these industries could make a real difference. And what I think is very important is for youth the need to be taught to consume media critically. So students are often just repeating the rhetoric and the ideas of mainstream, often biased news and television shows. But instead of just telling students not all Muslims are terrorists, we should actively create spaces for critical conversations that allow people to challenge the media they consume and to question the lens through which they see the world.
While I agree with my colleagues here, I just want to take this moment and give a shout out to Mufti Meg. I think he has been doing a tremendous job of, portraying Muslims in a positive light globally and connecting to.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughtful answers. And here's another question that I think gets at this, again, larger framework, or who should be educated about Islam and Islamophobia? And I think this is a question really reflects our larger awareness that Muslims are perceived negatively in the largely Western societies. In the United States, most Americans fear Muslims in one way or another. In Western Europe, often Muslims are least desirable neighbors. And so we have all those trends and statistics that confirm Islamophobia affects not only students in the classroom, but their parents and larger stakeholders in local communities. So this question asks, should something like Access Islam also be made available to older people? They're just as much rooted in Islamophobia, and educating them will perhaps also result in a trickle-down effect on children, and it won't differ from what the youth are learning either. Question to either group. How should we address the question of parents and parental bias towards Muslim and that impact on children and students?
I'm happy to start again. I would say this is a great question and a great plug for the next event where a parent model is actually talked about. So I think I won't speak too much for the other group, but I will say that, and something which we've discussed in our class, and it's seen in the research, that both within the classroom, it doesn't just mean that it's only students involved, it's all stakeholders as part of the process. So I think that would partially address those who say, are the parents of kids who are in school, but not everyone has kids, right? So then looking at the broader context, I think for those who do have the time, I think continuing education models are important. I think that, we don't often take as much faith in like community organizations. Like we should be empowering them. We should be giving them more time and more resources so that their events and their organization can actually be a active part of the community as opposed to a hindrance on people's time, right? And I think that kind of change in attitude is one way in which, and I have to say, I completely agree with the premise of the question. I think as a school of education, we are focusing on the young ones going through school, but I think that that's one part of the puzzle, but there are many other parts that we do feel the need that must be addressed. And it's harder, and it's, so yeah, I do appreciate the question.
And just to build on that, I think introducing Access Islam with its many faults within the discourse, or just like starting to talk about it, can start, say, community action or collective action towards discussing Islamophobia generally. I think it is formal institutions that kind of start or stir up the discussion, or perhaps even legitimize it. So if young learners are kind of being exposed to the diversity in their community in terms of ideology and cultures, it starts a conversation within their households and then to their larger communities, and perhaps like enriches our discourse with the diversity that we encounter.
To me, this, go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing to add. Something in the United States during the last 4 years is young people were encouraged to go home and have tough conversations with their family members, especially their parents. So I think that needs to be more encouraged among the younger communities and something more normalized.
For me, this takes me back to our critique that we presented during, during our presentation to the issue of discourse. The parents may not be at school at the moment, but if you take out the current representations of Muslims in the media, how you present them in newspapers, how you present them in news articles, in TV shows, in movies, in theater, just the general representation of Muslims, that oriental discourse that exists around Islam and Muslims needs to be targeted. When we do that, I think we won't need, hopefully, we won't need specific targeted programs to counter Islamophobia.
Thank you for those insights. There is one logistical, in a way, question, but I think question that speaks volumes in terms of the extent of Islamophobia and the lack of awareness, even within the graduate schools of education, that we do need to educate educators before they can educate students. And the question is, if my course on education, Islam, and radicalization is the only course of this type offered that deals with Islamophobia in the graduate schools of education in the United States. To my knowledge, I believe it is. And I think I would use this opportunity to call on not only Columbia University, but all other particularly elite institutions who educate future leaders and policymakers in education to reflect on that and to consider expanding those conversations within other institutions as well. And one question that I think is an interesting question that to an extent has been reflected particularly in this particularly in the second presentation is, how has anti-Semitism been addressed? Perhaps that could be a framework of addressing Islamophobia. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on that? And again, maybe we start with group 2 and group 1 if you have any insights as well.
I can start. So that was actually the starting point when we were doing a comparative analysis, and as to anti-Semitism has been a huge issue in the Western world and how that's been addressed through curriculum, and how it actually is a very, very detailed curriculum. But then again, if you're using that as a definitive guideline, we are again essentializing the problem of discrimination itself rather than dealing with the context of Islamophobia. So we suggested that perhaps it can be used as a framework, or the curriculum layout can be the same, but we cannot use it as the approach, as in we need to address Muslim history, Muslim civilization, Muslim cultures, and the problems that are very novel pertaining to Muslims in the West. For example, Muslim immigrants, or perhaps this imperial school of thought where they are otherized constantly. So the nature of problems that they deal with is quite different. And where we can use anti-Semitism as a framework, perhaps it might not be a definitive approach that can be applied on tackling this problem.
And here is unless anyone would like to add a comment, Vic, do you want? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one comment I'd like to add, I think the question regarding anti-Semitism is really interesting also because I won't speak towards curriculums, but what I will say is in this time of the pandemic with COVID-19, I think one thing which a lot of scholars have noticed is the discourse on virality related to Islamic communities and anti-Semitic Jewish communities being like, it's a virus, right? Like they are a virus. And that pathologizing is something which is identified in the discourse, which is shared. Now, I think that's something where, as we talked about in our presentation about working at the intersection, I know Faryal specifically talked about like interreligious education, right? So recognizing that the harms are common and that the discourse which is targeting both communities is using the same metaphor. So I think that is a great way to kind of locate the ways in which we share certain oppressions, not all of it, but certain parts of it. And this is a literal example of that. So there are approaches which can integrate, which are not so difficult. And sometimes you'll recognize that even the metaphors used against us are the same. So, yeah.
Thank you for that.
Both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia highlight the larger issues of exclusion and separation, which have allowed the sediments of Islamophobia to develop in recent years. So anti-racist curriculums in our schools and communities can be used to create and encourage a flourishing multiracial and multi-ethnic and multi-faith democracy. So although anti-Semitism and Islamophobia fit into different historical and political frames of references, I think it's correct in saying that similar approaches can be used to combat both.
Thank you for that addition, Kendra. And I would like to close with sort of one larger question, or that hopefully captures two questions posed by two different audience members as we close. One question is really asking, clearly, eagerly, can we decide on the first steps, priorities, what should we do, what is practical, what is doable, so that we can have certain outcomes within a reasonable time frame. And one comment or question, hello, correct me if I'm wrong, but some people think that some Muslims are nice because they're less Muslims, and I think that's something that Jihad has reflected on, than others. Do you think politics, economy, and colonialism affected this relationship? And as I hand over the floor to all of you, given that we were asked a question about what practically we can do, is here's a copy of my book that does deal with, recently published, that does deal with a number of issues that we discussed today: radicalization, Islamophobia, discrimination, exclusion. Next week, I will read a chapter to my students as we end our course this semester that can allow Muslims and non-Muslims to process some of these consequential impacts that Islamophobia has. The book details my own survival as a genocide, of a genocide in Bosnia against Bosnian Muslims during 1990s. And I am often perceived as that nicer version of a Muslim because I don't wear hijab or I don't wear burqa, but that doesn't lessen the targeting that as a Muslim one, and particularly a Muslim woman, one can experience as a result of Islamophobia in many societal contexts. So I just wanted to sort of end on an encouraging note that there is always something we can do. And I hope that within your operational frameworks and communities, all of you who are listening can take action to make a difference in your societies. And with that, I hand it over to the last reflection to both groups on what they believe can be done, what's doable, and what do we do about this perception that someone is a lesser of a Muslim because of their outward appearance.
I'd like to start by answering, responding to the last part. While we were talking about, the binaries that exist in the discourse, this is another one of those binaries, that exist in the Euro-American political media complex. Like, good Muslims are modern, they're secular, they're westernized, and quote unquote bad Muslims are doctrinal, they're anti-modern, and they're basically, which is simply not true. Like any community, Muslims are not one-dimensional. They're diverse, they're complex, they have different views towards religion. I mean, this is one of those I mean, to have any meaningful counter towards Islamophobia, this binary must be broken down as well.
I can take on the first question. I think throughout our reflections in classroom or our discussions throughout this course, the answer to practically alleviating discrimination towards Muslims seemed rather simple. It is just to listen to the people that you are teaching or interacting with, and having this very critical sense of empathy, whether you're an educator or just someone living within a community that is diverse. So just like the act of listening, practicing empathy, and treating people as to how they want to be treated or perceived, and understanding the nuances in their identity is the first step, say, as humans, rather than leaders, educators, or policymakers, that we can practically take to, say, have a better or more humanistic society.
I would also just like to briefly add, I think books like The Cat I Never Named are good examples of having narratives, like I have to say, I've not read a narrative of a young Bosnian Muslim woman, and I think the inclusion of those narratives in discourse is what results in these changes. And I think it's important that we've talked about representation today. Jyoti talked about how like looking for certain icons is like one way in which we could actually circumscribe and like only feel like you have to reach a certain status to start being talked about. But that's not the case. The case is that even in who gets to be seen and who gets to be talked about are political decisions, are decisions taken by people who may not look like you, people who may not think like you. And so I think having this book is a good example of how even throughout our course, right, and like the fact that a pedagogical experience is culminated in a public event, right? Like we hope to be public intellectuals. We're not learning for ourselves. We hope to learn for our communities, and reading stories like this, I think, are both inspiring, but also, as Amra's talked to us in class, it was a painful process and experience to even offer to a worldwide community. So recognizing those ethical and emotional costs, but honoring that by studying it and spreading the knowledge that we have, as we're doing today. So yeah.
I think also with respect to the questions about appearances, it's important to sort of tackle the fact that if your appearance is more religious, you're taken to be more radical or more, you're associated with the fact that you are prone to be more radical or more violent. Or so maybe it's important to identify those areas where these kinds of stereotypes stem from and inculcate them into discourse, and have more conversations about them in academic settings or otherwise. So yeah, that's just one input that I had.
Thank you, everyone. And as we end our program, twice extended today, I would like to invite you to join us for the second part in this two-part series on countering Islamophobia through education this coming Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you to all of our organizers, guests, and participants for engaging in this important work on countering Islamophobia, and we look forward to seeing you all on Monday.